Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here and welcome to the BGC. I am Leonie Treier. I am a PhD candidate here and I study the histories of collecting and displaying Native North American material culture. For those of you who are here for the first time, we are a research institute that specializes in studying the history of humanity through objects. We do so in the classroom, through our study collection, public lectures, and also exhibitions, which you can find a few buildings down the block. If you haven't seen them yet, I'd encourage you to see our current shows, Shaped by the Loom, Weaving Worlds in the American Southwest, and Staging the Table, before they close in July. I would also like to thank the Public Humanities team, Andrew, Nadia, and Laura, for encouraging students to invite scholars whose research they value. And I would also like to thank the BGC's facility staff for setting everything up for us. As we engage with material culture and study the relations of people to objects, as well as between peoples, it is important to situate ourselves. We are here on the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape, and we recognize New York City as a past, present, and future home for many Indigenous people. Land acknowledgements honor customary Indigenous protocols for the thanking of hosts and call attention to ongoing realities of settler colonialism. In my own dissertation, I look closely at the settler painter George Catlin and his Indian gallery, in which he displayed paintings and objects alongside each other in the 1830s and 1840s. I specifically focus on his collection of items that were partly fabricated, likely by himself, so they would look Native American to his audience on the East Coast and in Europe. Therefore, I'm very excited to have been able to invite Janet Catherine Berlo to speak here for us today. Her work has influenced my own research and thinking for a long time. Before I hand over the podium to Janet, I would like to briefly highlight a few of her impressive achievements and contributions to the field, and if you're curious, you can find her CV online as well. She is a Professor Emerita of Art History and Visual and Cultural Studies at the University of Rochester, has taught Native art history as a visiting professor at Harvard and Yale, and has received grants from the Guggenheim and Getty Foundations, among others. She holds a PhD in the history of art from Yale, and is the author of a widely used textbook, Native North American Art, with Canadian scholar Ruth Phillips. Janet is perhaps best known for her work on 19th century Plains Indian drawings, including the 1998 Traveling Exhibition and Catalog, Plains Indian Drawings, 1865 to 1935, and the book, Spirit Beings and Sun Dancers, Black Hawk's Vision of the Lakota World. She's also a co-author with Judith Bethlehem of the Traveling Exhibition and Catalog, Jose Bedia, Transcultural Pilgrim, which focused on the Cuban American artists' relationship with African and Native North American art and ceremony. In addition to co-authoring the innovative textbook American Encounters, Art, History, and Cultural Identity, Janet has also published on quilt history, folk art, and outsider art. Her essays have appeared in Third Text, Art History, Museum Anthropology, American Indian Art Magazine, and the exhibition catalogs of the National Museum of the American Indian, the Metropolitan Museum, the Peabody Essex Museum, the Etelrup Museum, and many others. As I learned after our invitation to Janet, this evening is somewhat of a full circle moment for her and the BGC. In 2013, before my time here, my supervisor Aaron Glass had invited Janet for a talk in which she discussed themes relating to replication and transformation in Navajo sand painting, which will now feature in her forthcoming book. Tonight she will speak to us about this book, which is titled Not Native American Art, Fakes, Replicas, and Invented Traditions, which will be out in November from the University of Washington Press. Please join me all in welcoming Janet. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. Bard Graduate Center is one of my favorite places. I think you do really remarkable work here, and they're remarkable faculty and students. So I'm happy to sort of bracket this book, which has been, that I've been working on and not working on over a period of 10 years. Okay, so several years ago, I was a senior fellow at the Georgia O'Keeffe Research Center in Santa Fe, working on the book that's the subject of this talk. Santa Fe is, of course, an excellent place to think deeply about the misrepresentation and replication of Native American art. The city's plaza is itself a picturesque simulacrum of an ideal that never existed, as Chris Wilson's fine book, The Myth of Santa Fe, documents. Early 20th century town planning and tourism initiatives sought to suppress a complex history in favor of a simple story of a harmonious cultural past and present. And today, in shops around the plaza, real 19th century Zuni jars selling for $16,000 are displayed next to ersatz native jewelry. Potholders made in India and t-shirts made in China sport ancient Mimbres pottery designs. And more 19th century Navajo rugs that could possibly have been made by a veritable army of industrious Navajo women are offered for sale. Now, my earlier publications focused on the real stuff, from ancient Mesoamerican pottery to 19th century Plains graphic arts to contemporary native art. But I'm also interested in how the real gets translated, filtered, transformed, deformed, and copied in numerous ways. Like many scholars, I'm fascinated by what Arjun Appadurai calls the social life of things. Of course, it's essential to understand as much as possible about original makers and users of works of art and the meanings that these individuals imbued into their belongings. But we also must analyze the complex trajectories of objects after they've been removed from their original context and set in play in new social realms, and, of course, how they've been replicated and how these replications move through time and space. There's also an urgent need to grapple with issues of forgery, as well as issues I group under the rubric of vexed identities, that is, complex situations that cannot be easily defined. In contrast to the larger field of art history, there's almost no literature on these topics. They're discussed privately among dealers and scholars, but seldom addressed publicly. Also, I find that people think that there are simple answers about misrepresentation, cultural appropriation, and replication. But one of the things I really seek in my book to demonstrate is that there are many different types of replicative strategies, each of which has to be understood within its own historical moment. So, if my book is called Not Native American Art, I suppose the obvious question is, well, what is authentic or real Native American art? Because that's a complex adjective carrying lots of assumptions. In most cases, if somebody asks me that question, I simply say, it's authentic Native American art if it was made by a Native American. Well, yes, maybe. Yes and no, not to everybody. Some people, for example, have very old-fashioned ideas about what real Native art is. Some members of the general public and some collectors, if presented with these two images, would unhesitatingly say that the one at upper right is authentic Native American art, but in fact, each is authentic for its own era. Rose Simpson takes the pottery of her Santa Clara heritage, mixes it with her training as a car mechanic and her master's degree from RISD, and comes up with an ambitious 20th century art form, a car she calls Maria. This was in the lobby. I was one of the committee of Native women and non-Native women who worked on the big traveling show, The Heart of Our People, at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and the curators got this. And it was in the lobby as you went into the show. And it was like, if this doesn't teach people that, this is real Native American art. So I love that piece. So she's paying homage to Maria Martinez, arguably the most famous Native artist of the 20th century. She achieved worldwide fame for the excellence of her pottery. In fact, she and her work became so famous by the 1930s that it caused an imbalance in the normally egalitarian pueblo, because her work was bringing much higher prices than that of the other potters. But she and the other women of her village came up with a solution to this economic imbalance. One woman might shape the pot and cover it with slip, a creamy solution of watered down clay that would dry and then need polishing or burnishing. She would sometimes burnish the pots that other women had shaped and slipped, and after she burnished them, someone else might paint them with the geometric designs characteristic of San Ildefonso blackware. Sometimes Maria signed these pots, for her signature was the one that the buying public recognized and the one that brought the big bucks. So, a pot signed by the famous Maria Martinez that she may not have formed, or slipped, or painted herself. Do we call that a fake? In fact, no, this was a uniquely Pueblo solution to the social problem of one potter's fame and income exceeding all others. Sign the pot. The buyer will be happy. The maker will get a higher price than usual, so she'll be happy. Maria Martinez will certainly be happy because she won't be subject to the criticism of her neighbors. After all, within the village, the women knew who had made what. A signature was simply a convention to please an outsider. Now, in the post-Renaissance Western world, we have an ideology of authenticity that rests on the importance of a signature. People who haven't studied art history in depth probably assume that a signature means that the designer made the work. But of course, if we think a little more about it, we know that in 16th and 17th century European painting workshops, for example, many workers might have contributed to a painting that only the master would sign. And maybe he would have only painted the faces while others did the drapery and the landscape. Something that the contemporary art world phenom Kehinde Wiley also does in his workshop in China, though I do assume that he really did the presidential commission himself. Now, the more I labored on this book over the last few years, the more I questioned how much of what we see in museums is, in fact, authentic native art. Here's an example. A 19th century object type found in every museum that has native art, the Catlinite pipe bowl. Its material is named for the American artist George Catlin, and it's a soft, easily carved stone. Most catlinite comes from a quarry in southwestern Minnesota that's been mined by native people for centuries. It became Pipestone National Monument in 1937, and today, only members of federally recognized tribes are allowed to mine the stone. Thousands and thousands of catlinite pipes exist in museum and private collections. Surely thousands more have been passed down within native families. Catlinite pipes are well known across the Plains and Great Lakes region and have been used by native people for countless generations. Offered in ceremony as well as in intercultural negotiations, the smoking of the pipe is both a legal and a spiritual contract. But many people are unaware that the history of catlinite pipes has long been a story of the intertwining of native and white interests. The 19th century literature makes this clear. When Catlinite visited the quarry and painted this scene of it in 1836, he claims that he was told, "No white men have ever been to the Pipestone quarry, and the chiefs have often decided in council that no white man ever shall go to it," except him is the implication there. Yet in fact, 5 years earlier, one fur trader had been there with some native men, and he wrote that they all had worked the quarry and had gotten material for about 20 good pipes. 3 decades later, in 1865, another trader wrote, and I quote, "A large quantity of the pipestone was manufactured into Indian pipes and other things by machinery. General Sully had expected to make a treaty with the Sioux, and as the red stone pipes were prized highly with them, he engaged with me for 5,000 pipes at $5 apiece." This is 1865. "I employed men to make them under the supervision of one of the earliest settlers of Dakota. Sully did not make the treaty as expected, but the pipes were no loss, as we traded them to good advantage with the Indians all along the Missouri." So even in the 19th century, there was a veritable industry in white men making pipes for Indian trade and diplomacy. It's not surprising then that in 1907, one scholarly source claimed that the Indians who mined pipestone at the end of the 19th century sold much of the stone to whites who, I quote, "have taken up the manufacture of pipes using lathes to aid in the work." In fact, in 1892, one authority stated, "Not 1% of the pipes made were of Indian manufacture." Now, this was an era when collectors and anthropologists were forming museum collections and were deeply invested in the idea that they were collecting so-called traditional things made by native people. If it's true that in 1892, not 1% of the pipes were of Indian manufacture, what does this mean for all the pipe bowls held in museum collections across the world? I think that this example indicates how long forgotten historical facts may differ with received information, received wisdom about objects. And just because a Catlinite pipe has indigenous iconography doesn't mean it was necessarily native made. Obviously, object makers in all culture tailor their imagery to their clientele. But this story also brings up an important flaw in the way that we think about native art. Most people see it as a category with strict boundaries around it. Either something is Native American or it is not. But neither cultures nor artists have walls around them, as will be evident in some of my examples. So let's consider the language we might use to discuss what is or is not native art. Most of the first chapter of my book examines this nomenclature. Of course, there's no singular native definition of an original, or a copy, or a replica. Each clan or nation, or even clans within a nation, may have its own way of thinking about such objects. A powerful painting or beadwork design could come to a Plains Indian artist in a dream. A Tlingit chief owned and still owns today the rights to totemic images associated with his particular family or clan. In such cases, an individual might sell the object itself or transfer to another artist the rights to remake such an object, and it's really the ownership of the image, emblem, or idea that is fundamental. Sometimes subsequent versions of an object were thought to have the same status as the original. Crow men told anthropologist Robert Lowy in the early 20th century that if a shield was replicated too much, its powers might begin to fade by the third or fourth version. In most native nations, there's some version of the idea that one must acknowledge the ownership of intellectual or spiritual property and that promiscuous copying was to be avoided. Okay, so I like to offer some ways of thinking about replication and the way replication plays out in particular circumstances, drawing some definitions from other fields of art history in order to test their applicability to the native North American situations. And tonight I only have time for a few of the terms that I consider in the opening chapter of my book. I want to mention just briefly one kind of replica, the so-called revival-style rugs made by some Navajo weavers today. For them, replicating the celebrated 19th century chief's blankets is both homage to their ancestors and a way of making a living in an art world that overvalues 150-year-old textiles. Many collectors complain that a finely woven contemporary Navajo rug can cost $3,000 or $5,000 or $15,000, but at the highest end of the collector's market are people who will pay more than $1 million for a rare 19th century example. Some of these same people would never buy a contemporary Navajo weaving. Now, we know that Navajo textiles have been recognized for generations as a major art form, with many museums displaying them as works of art, so it seems inevitable that less expensive knockoffs would be made. For decades, male weavers of Zapotec and Mestizo, or mixed heritage in Oaxaca, Mexico, have been producing knockoffs of Navajo textiles on their treadle looms. The books on their shelves attest to the global circulation of images. When I lectured on a Smithsonian tour to the village of Teotitlan del Valle in the early 1990s, I saw copies of exhibition catalogs of Navajo textiles, as well as books on South African rock art, Picasso paintings, and ancient Mexican mural paintings, all of which provided inspiration for the rugs they weave for tourists. Should have taken a slide of that bookcase. I didn't, because I wasn't doing so much North American Indian art history at that time. I was still a Mesoamericanist. So Teotitlan del Valle is the center of the Zapotec weaving industry. It's a village of some 5,000 people in Oaxaca, and its reputation as a center of weaving goes back to pre-Hispanic times. The building of a better road system in the mid-20th century made it easier to expand the market throughout Mexico and abroad. It also allowed many tourists to travel to buy the weavings at the source. Anthropologist W. Warner Wood, in his book Made in Mexico, Zapotec Weavers and the Global Ethnic Art Market, brilliantly demonstrates that to really comprehend Zapotec weavings, one must understand them as part of a global aesthetic and economic discourse. The way Zapotec textiles are presented to the consumer on commercial web pages or in shops in Santa Fe is an image that is often decades out of date, precisely because most consumers seek to purchase a piece of authenticity. Buyers would rather hear a romantic story about traditions, symbols, and ancestors, rather than about marketing, globalization, and the internet. There's a short video on Vimeo about a Zapotec weaver named Porfirio Gutierrez, and it exemplifies this. In his nearly unaccented English, the weaver invokes the ancestors and Mother Earth multiple times within the 6-minute video. He says, "My father told me that my ancestors started this art form more than 2,000 years ago, and the loom helps me bring these pieces alive and keeps teaching me what I can do. It is not me that dictates what I need to do. It is Mother Earth. It is my ancestors." Now, I'm not saying that this is inaccurate, but I'm saying that it's somewhat disingenuous, because what it principally does is that it feeds the limitless hunger that modern Euro-Americans have for romantic and noble narratives about indigenous people that, in my opinion, seeks to deny them their modernity. Wood terms this attention to romance rather than reality descriptive denial. This is an excellent characterization of the way such myth-making carefully conceals global circuits behind a romantic narrative of indigenous production. In 1988, after seeing the important exhibition from the Navajo loom, the William Randolph Hearst collection at the LA County Museum, a gallery owner in Beverly Hills got the idea to market a new line of rugs based on this significant collection that had been formed in the early 20th century. He worked with Teotihuacan dyers and weavers to ensure that the colors and patterns closely matched the plates in the exhibition catalog. Many of the large rugs in the Hearst series, as the gallery owner called it, were direct copies of textiles in this famous collection and were sold at high prices to Hollywood notables. When I was in Teotihuacan del Valle in the early 1990s, I bought one of the inexpensive Navajo-style rugs to use in teaching about the globalized tourist art industry. And the easiest way to tell a cross-cultural reproduction like this one from a real Navajo rug is that almost all Navajo weavings have a continuous warp, which produces 4 completely twined selvages. Zapotec rugs like the one on the right have a fringe at top and bottom. And my rug is quite small. It's slightly smaller than what you see on the right there, and only loosely follows the pattern of the Hearst rug. Now, of course, one positive way to think about it is that Zapotec replicas of Navajo rugs not only provide an income for the weavers, that's obvious, but they also provide a way for less affluent consumers to have a version of what they admire. And it's important to remember that the history of Navajo weaving is also a series of borrowings and reinterpretations. But perhaps Navajo weavers would not find this such an egregious affront if these cross-cultural reproductions, as I call them, were not sold in the same shops in Santa Fe and Scottsdale where Navajo textiles are featured. To the uninformed consumer, one looks just like the other, but the Navajo version, woven far more slowly on a fixed vertical loom, may cost as much as 10 times more than the Mexican version. Let's look at different types of replication of ancient Mimbres pottery to tease out some ideas about what work replication can do. But first, a bit of background on Mimbres art for those of you who might not be familiar with it. In the 11th and 12th centuries, people in villages along the Mimbres River Valley in southwestern New Mexico created the painted pottery that came to be so valued in the 20th century. Mimbres villages were modest. They were nothing as grand as the architecture of their Pueblo neighbors to the north. So it's not a region that tourists visit to see the ruins. The finest work of Mimbres people was their painted pottery. Mimbres potters often used negative painting. Black paint forms designs on the surface of the mottled, white-slipped interior of the bowl. And in some cases, the white portion reads as the design, as in the upper right image. Mimbres artists were consummate graphic designers, and this was recognized even at the beginning of the 20th century. Their work was prominently featured in the important 1941 MoMA show of Native North American art. And these potters deftly painted their designs within the curved surfaces of these bowls. And we assume here, as in the later Southwest, probably it was principally women who were the potters and the pottery painters. Now, Pueblo potters, 20th century and 21st century Pueblo potters, have found inspiration in the work of their distant ancestors of the southern New Mexico. Starting at the end of the 19th century, some Pueblo men served as workmen on archaeological excavations, and some took home potsherds to share with potters in their families or to use themselves as inspiration for pottery painting. And so this enlarged the scope of visual materials from which they drew. And as books were more widely circulated within Pueblo communities, potters found inspiration there too. More recently, potters have had Native artist fellowships in museums in order to formally study the work of artists of the past. So all of this has provided means for ancient themes and style to become incorporated into contemporary Native art. I can only offer a couple of examples, but this would be a wonderful topic for somebody, not me, to write a whole book on. Now, Julian Martinez, husband of the legendary potter Maria, was both an easel painter and a pottery painter. He drew inspiration from pottery shards that he found while working as an excavation assistant at sites in New Mexico in the first decade of the 20th century. But it's clear that his feather designs came from Mimbres pots themselves, or more likely, illustrations of Mimbres pots he had seen. One publication, Designs on Prehistoric Pottery from the Mimbres Valley, was issued in 1923 and contains what surely was the inspiration for Martinez's early radiating feather design. And given what we know about Santa Fe in the first 30 years of the 20th century, there was a lot of interaction between artists and archaeologists and other cultural interlocutors. There's no reason to think that these people did not see these publications. A plate made by Julian and Maria about 1930 bears a design of two mountain lions. This almost exactly copies the Mimbres mountain lion bowl drawn in an archaeological report in 1924. Of course, artists in every culture reference the past and the work of others by incorporating themes or stylistic elements from elsewhere into their work. So when Native artists of the Southwest do this, it's not appropriation in the way it is when a modern non-Native artist does it. It's rather drawing upon a wide web of ancestral designs for inspiration. So I think of it as a recuperative gesture, a dialogue between past and present. A number of contemporary Native potters, especially at Acoma, continue to replicate Mimbres pottery designs, but to my knowledge, none of them tries to replicate the processes by which Mimbres potters and painters did their work. One Anglo couple, Laurel and Paul Thornburg, who are retired now, I interviewed them at least 10 years ago. They did spend many years replicating the entire process of a 1,000-year-old technology. They didn't make up any designs. They simply replicated those on vessels from archaeological excavations. And it was very important to them only to use pieces that they knew came from archaeological excavations, so that they knew that they weren't copying anything that might have been fake. And it was interesting to me that they call their works authentic replicas. something that, we might think is a contradiction in terms, right? But even replicas have degrees of veracity. They estimated that in 30 years of doing this work, they probably made some 3,000 copies of Mimbres bowls. In his youth, Paul was an apprentice to a stoneware potter, and so that taught him about clays and tempers and firing materials. In 1987, they traveled to southwestern New Mexico in search of appropriate clays and tempering materials to make Mimbres bowls, and they believe that they are using the same materials used 1,000 years ago. Almost nothing that the Thornburgs used was of commercial manufacture. Here you see Paul using a slim strand of yucca laden with iron ore pigment, and he says that a yucca brush can hug the curve of the bowl to produce narrow lines that can't be reproduced with modern hair fiber brushes. I found when I interviewed them that the word authentic cropped up a lot. Of course, to state the obvious, they're not native. Their work is not ethnically authentic, but in terms of its manufacture, it is. They grind their mineral pigments with a stone mano and metate. The bowls are shaped and coiled by hand in the same way that ancient indigenous potters and most modern Pueblo potters do, and they don't deviate at all from real Mimbres iconography. Moreover, they document the results of all their experiments in photos and in voluminous notes and plan to donate their archive to the Arizona State Museum in Tucson, which has a comprehensive collection of southwestern pottery. Several archaeologists believe that to collect the Thornburgs' replicas is to strike a blow against the looting of archaeological sites. One has written, "The Thornburgs' work gives people who want to own a Mimbres bowl a beautiful, legitimate, and legal alternative to pot-hunted artifacts." The Thornburgs understand that their scrupulous authenticity in production methods might allow others to pass off their work as real Mimbres pieces from 1,000 years ago. So since the late 1980s, they have painted in large scale the date of manufacture on the bottom of the bowls in a tungsten ore. This is invisible to the naked eye because it's under the slip. So while somebody could take a bowl like this and they could sand off what they write on the surface of the bowl, and that has been done, unless the bowl is looked at with a ultraviolet light, they won't see that it fluoresces because of this scheelite, this tungsten ore that is invisible to the naked eye. So some people might be quick to condemn copies of ancient native vessels made by non-native people, but to my knowledge, there are not native people making this work in precisely this way. So in my opinion, at least, it takes no livelihood away from a native artist. I've interviewed Pueblo artists who do make Mimbres replicas, but with commercial clay and commercial firing techniques, but no one who follows the ancient practice. To go further afield for replication of Mimbres pottery, we can look to Nicaragua, where in the pottery-making village of San Juan de Oriente, the Bracamonte family occasionally makes Mimbres-style pots for North American clientele. Here, the same often published ancient bowls that the Thornburgs copied, made in Nicaragua. Here, one that I purchased over the internet with the same mountain lion imagery that Julian Martinez used, though this bowl would never be mistaken for an ancient Mimbres vessel or even a modern Pueblo one. It's thick-walled and very heavy and somewhat larger. Now, sometimes objects don't replicate one historical prototype, but draw from several. Let's look at one example. In 17th century France, art critic Roger de Pile proposed a definition for the term pastiche that still holds up today. Paintings that are neither originals nor copies are called pastiches, from the Italian pastici, which means pastries, because as the different things that flavor a dish are mixed together in order to produce a singular taste, so too all of the imitations that compose a pastiche aim to make one truth appear. In Baroque Italy, the pastiche was sometimes admired as the ambitious artist's way of selecting among the best features of the work of different painters to make an even better painting. Later, the pastiche would come to be derided as unoriginal. The term in modern art history is generally derogatory, and I follow that practice. The Detroit Institute of Art holds an object of complex cross-cultural parentage, a supposedly Meskwaki bear claw necklace that is a true pastiche, although this fact is only known to a small number of scholars. This object has been published a number of times and exhibited in major traveling shows, including on the cover of this 1970 exhibition catalog that helped define the stylistic features of this region. The necklace has 40 bear claws, each separated by a blue European trade bead and attached to an otter fur ruff. We know about many such necklaces from photos and paintings of 19th century Plains men. David Penny, former curator of Native American art at Detroit and now vice president of the National Museum of the American Indian, terms this piece notorious and described it to me as having been assembled by Milford Chandler from several other necklaces, fragments of beadwork, and fresh otter pelts. Indeed, as our 17th century French critic reminds us, such as the quintessential pastiche, fragments put together to make one truth appear. So who was Milford Chandler, and why would he do this? Chandler was a collector of native artifacts and a hobbyist who spent a great deal of time with native people of the Great Lakes and Plains. Hobbyists were everywhere in the 20th century, usually non-native men, white men, who sought to understand Native American objects by remaking them and dressing in native garb for their meetings and powwows. I'm not covering hobbyists very deeply in my book because my colleague Clyde Ellis, who is a historian, is finishing a book about the white men who played Indian, in Phil Deloria's terms, and who in the mid-20th century became a major repository of knowledge about the materials and the makings of native objects. Chandler, by all accounts, was obsessed with the bear claw necklace as an object type. In fact, he made 3 of them. One was offered for sale, to my great surprise, at Skinner's auction house in Boston in 2013. I find it curious that in a sale of, quote, American Indian and ethnographic arts, such an object would be presented, yet the catalog was completely transparent about its history, calling it only Pawnee style, and saying that it was assembled by Milford Chandler. Like the necklace at Detroit, it's an indisputably beautiful object, again 40 claws and rare 19th century Italian beads, and the essay in the Skinner catalog says that Chandler even added to it over time. So this example was a work in progress, always able to be improved while in the hobbyist's hands. According to the auction catalog, it was displayed at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming from the 1970s to 2002, presumably as a real object of American Indian art. Now, in the world of American Indian artifact collecting, Chandler's name has its own pedigree, and surely the combined mythos of the now extinct Plains grizzly bear and the well-known collector Milford Chandler is what caused this pastiche to achieve at auction a price of $57,000, nearly 3 times its estimate. So these objects are more than replicas, for portions had a legitimate pedigree. Certainly many paintings that would later be dismissed as mere pastiches have been owned and exhibited in art museums of the world, so maybe it's not surprising that Chandler's bear claw necklaces have been widely exhibited in museums. Yet if one applies the standards of the American Institute of Conservators Code of Ethics, which states that the aim of restoration is to, quote, preserve and reveal the aesthetic value of the original work of art, Chandler's objects do not hold up to current museological standards. The one in the Detroit Institute is presented as a coherent whole. Indeed, the page for it on their website says only under provenance, purchased by Milford Chandler at Tama, Iowa. Not exactly accurate. Often in the art world, especially the commercial art world, the hunger for the pristine object in a perfect state of restoration supersedes common sense. That's why an object such as Chandler's bear claw necklaces, put together beautifully by an expert but non-native hobbyist collector, can hold pride of place on the cover of an exhibition catalog and become a canonical object. Unfortunately, those not in the private information circuit of an older group of curators and scholars will take it for the real thing. For our next example, let's turn to the well-known cultures of the Northwest Coast with an example that draws upon Haida art of British Columbia, Canada. Art historian Alexander Nagel has called forgery the copy's evil twin. In Native cultures, copies are made for many reasons, as I've said before, as homage, as renewal, as a privilege given to one artist by another. But forgery is an evil twin indeed. As some of you may know, the cultures of the Northwest Coast, Tlingit, Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw, are best known for their monumental sculptural arts, totem poles, house fronts, masks, and other ceremonial objects. But notably, this forgery does not copy one of the great 19th century masks, some of which sell for 6 figures on the art market, while others are being repatriated from museums to their original owners. In 2001, a Santa Fe couple with an important collection of Northwest Coast contemporary art were at the popular flea market that used to be held near the Santa Fe Opera House. At first, it was one of those moments that every collector who haunts flea markets hopes for. They spotted a contemporary Northwest Coast mask in excellent condition for $50. As you see, this mask combines human and bird-like features with strands of hair inserted at the top. The lips, nostrils, and eyebrows are red, and Northwest Coast designs are painted on the cheeks, eyebrows, and foreheads, while form-line designs are the hallmark of painting and carving as done by Tlingit, Haida, and other northern artists for more than 200 years. These are not very expertly done. The artist was not very good at the elegant tapering of form-line designs. Since at least 1990, we know that Northwest Coast-style masks have been made in workshops in Indonesia and imported to the United States. Many are well-known forgeries of the work of, many are outright forgeries of the work of well-known artists. Before the widespread use of Google Images and the advent of online sales at eBay, which was established in 1995, these weren't easy to track. But Stephen Lazarus, who sold authentic Northwest Coast art in his Montreal store since 1990, has been documenting the flood of these fakes for more than 25 years. When I sought him out to discuss this, he recognized the source of this mask immediately, a mask by Haida artist Don Yeomans, published in 1994 in a book called Spirit Faces. It's clear the book went to Indonesia and carvers passed it around. Yeomans is a well-known contemporary carver whose work has been featured in many exhibits of Northwest Coast art. His totem pole commissions grace the Stanford University campus and the Vancouver airport. When pictures of the original and the fake are compared, the deficiencies of the Indonesian mask are quite apparent. The painted designs on Yeomans' mask are masterful. His has inset shell teeth, which would not have been clear to a carver copying from a book. The teeth on the Indonesian mask are part of the wood structure and are delineated only by shallow cuts in the wood. The hair is much shorter and sparser than the long, lustrous horsehair in Yeomans' mask, and the fake also lacks the feathers at the top of the mask, and I presume that's because the middlemen who commissioned these masks know that the inclusion of feathers would bring up questions when the carvings entered the United States because of laws about migratory birds, so it's likely that the carver was told to omit them. While most authentic Northwest Coast masks are made of red cedar or alder wood, Indonesian forgeries are usually made of albizia, a fast-growing tropical wood. Cedar and alder are light-grained, while tropical woods are not. When you hold this mask in your hand, if you've handled Northwest Coast mask, when you hold this mask in your hand, you go, oh, it's just light as a feather. Albizia has an open cell grain, and this shows up on the wood as these straight broken lines. And since Indonesian carvers are working from photos rather than three-dimensional objects, the backs of their masks have smooth, flat curves. I queried Don Yeomans about this theft of his work. I expressed consternation on his behalf, but interestingly enough, he said to me, "The truth is, most people interested in our art cannot afford to buy the real thing. Sweatshop products do not threaten the value of the real object. In every art form, there is a very small core of original artists. Everything else is derivative. If your business is being original, dwelling on what anyone else is doing tends to stop the creative process. I was surprised by this, but I admire his ability to rise above the tawdriness of the international circuit of appropriation and forgery. The Montreal art dealer told me that for him it was discouraging when neophyte collectors couldn't discern the difference and would question him about the reasons for the great disparity in price between a $100 mask they saw in a tourist shop and one offered for several $1,000s by a named Haida artist in a real art gallery, where a dealer invests time and money in nurturing artists in their work and educating collectors. Now, I'd like to end by offering one example of something I called vexed identities. When I sent information to Bard about the title of this talk, I used the word vexed identities in the title, and that was in the flyer that you saw. But my book publishers at the University of Washington Press were very worried that the general public would get the heebie-jeebies if the word, what is a vexed identity? You know, we can't sell a book with that in the title. So that's why my book title now has Invented Traditions in the subtitle rather than vexed identities. I use in the book, just not in the title. But this is an example of vexed identity. There are lots of different versions of intercultural contexts in which art is produced. Concerning this one, some people would say it's legitimate. Other people would say it is yet another example of white people ripping off native traditions. You'll have to decide for yourself. About 10 years ago, I interviewed a contemporary quilt worker in South Dakota. His name is Chris Ravenswood, and he is Belgian. More than 30 years ago, he came to South Dakota to visit a Belgian friend who had married a Lakota, and he never went home. He apprenticed himself to elderly Lakota women and learned the art of quill work, something very few young Lakota were interested in 3 decades ago, though since then there's been quite a tremendous revival of these skills. Ravenshead told me that he learned Lakota before he learned English. In fact, his Lakota wife says he speaks English with a Lakota accent, and he says that's because he learned both Lakota and English from old Lakota ladies. His quill work is as skillful as anything made by any Northern Plains artist working today. Here he's showing me how to take the sinew from a buffalo shoulder and turn it into thread. Sinew-sewn quill work is especially valued, for it's a very old technique from before the Lakota had thread. When Ravenshead sells his work, it's clearly marked as non-native. He sells it principally at Prairie Edge Trading Company in Rapid City, South Dakota, which offers fine work by both native and non-native artists. This gallery forms part of a case study in another chapter in my book. Much of his work replicates 19th century beadwork and hide painting. So is it problematic that Ravenswood earns money making native-style artwork? He's married into a Lakota family. Some native people would say yes, he doesn't have the right to do this for economic gain, but clearly the Lakota women who taught him thought he had the right to learn it. And his Lakota wife proudly says, "Quill work built this house." I interviewed them in their home, and she said, "Quill work built this house." So I've given you a survey of just a few of the troubling issues and objects examined in my book, which will be out in November of this year from the University of Washington Press. My colleagues tease me about how long it's been in progress. More than 10 years. My pal John Lukovic, curator at the Denver Art Museum, says he's looking forward to volumes 1 through 4. But I'm done. I don't seek to be exhaustive. This topic is nearly unlimited, and I seek to offer only a few fascinating case studies and to open a dialogue about such issues so that others can dispute my work, build on my work, take it in new directions. I thank you all for your attention today.
All right, first of all, thank you so much for this very fascinating talk and all the different examples that you were presenting to us. I'm very impressed by the depth, geographically, regionally, well, that's the same word, but historically. And I was just wondering, like, asking a very BGC question because we are here, if you could talk a little bit more about kind of how you approach objects that are in museum collections already.
Kind of further away. Objects that are what?
That are in museum collections already, and kind of approaching them that don't have a historical kind of history or documentation that says or leads us to believe that they may be fakes or have been altered or have been fabricated in some way. So, like, what role does the study of close looking play in your work?
Well, if I can kind of approach that question from around the backside, I was a grad student in the 1970s. I went to Yale, which was had a PhD program that was very diverse. We had people who really did connoisseurial work. We did people who were pioneering the social history of art. We had Robert Farris Thompson, who was drumming on the podium and chanting in Yoruba and teaching us about African festivals. And I was, a young feminist, very interested in new ways of looking at objects. And I thought connoisseurship was the most boring thing that I had ever heard. And I didn't want to know anything about connoisseurship. I thought, oh, they're worried about this little brushstroke or that little brushstroke. Well, then, my career went on. I changed from being a Mesoamericanist. I began to work on North American Indian art, specifically 19th century Plains Indian drawings. And one day I found myself in a classroom. I taught at the University of Missouri in St. Louis then. I found myself in a classroom with 5 slide projectors projecting different drawings by 19th century Plains graphic artists using the very old-fashioned standard Morellian method named for a 19th century Italian art historian who claimed that artists revealed their hand by little details like how is the earlobe shaped? How are the fingers shaped? And I thought, how have I come to this? But it was important to me. It was exciting to be able to find named artists in the 19th century. And then after that, as we began to have many more Native people part of the museum project, specifically Native artists, weavers like D.Y. Begay, Navajo D.Y. Begay, knows so much about materials and natural dyes and so forth. And there's a Métis curator in Canada named Barjaillon, I can't think of his first name, but anyway, he studied hide painting with Northern Plains old women and, taught us tons about hide painting techniques and so forth. So we're in an exciting period where Native practices of connoisseurship can mix with centuries-old European practices of connoisseurship. And I think, luckily, after a period where so many, not here, but so many other places, people were not that interested in the object. They were interested in the theoretical apparatus they could build around the object. Even in, I hear some of my colleagues talk about materiality, the new materiality. In my opinion, I don't know, maybe Aaron would agree or disagree. In my opinion, 3/4 of the people I've heard talking that way have never picked up a paintbrush, a spindle, a piece of fiber, anything. It's a theory of materiality. But I think we're more and more, with Bart as one of the leaders, we're more and more getting back to those issues of looking very closely at things rather than just trying to wrap our theories around them. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Great. Thank you so much. If anyone in the audience has questions, please raise your hand and we'll have a mic.
I wondered if you have time to go into the Museum of Natural History to see their new galleries where they brought the indigenous population in and they decided what should be there, what shouldn't be there. Have you had a look at that?
I'm hoping tomorrow morning before I have an afternoon plane home, but I'm hoping to do that tomorrow morning. But no, I haven't yet. But, that was such a paradigmatic museum collection for all of us, for generations. I'm dying to see it.
And it's always been interesting to me, and I've talked to Arjun about this, that in a lot of invocations of the kind of biography of the object approach, even that cite him, people sort of tend to forget the subtitle of that book, which is Commodities in Cultural Perspective. And I was struck in your talk that the fact that many of these things circulate as commodities was important.
Yeah.
And my question to you is, are there examples in the book or from the research that didn't make it in the book in which issues of replication outside of the market sphere have come up? And I mean, are these things only a problem because they enter commercial markets, or are there examples where the conceptual slipperiness of what we might identify as the kind of ontological identity, like what these things are as objects, have you come across contexts where that the problem of what they are isn't entangled with the market and value and issues of like competition for,
I think so. Probably I'll send you an email in the middle of the night when I come up with the best, not a text, I'll do it in an email when I think of the best example. Well, in terms of what I was saying about crow shields, my understanding is, I could be wrong, is that some of those crow shields were made internally. They weren't necessarily made for the anthropologists who were going to take them out. Again, something will come to me in an hour, but I don't have anything right now. At dinner, I'll shout it out. Sorry.
That the issues that you focus on are mostly implicated in some kind of market transaction. That the problem of identifying authenticity has been motivated in part by circulation through kind of commercial markets.
Yeah, it seems once things become part of a floating system through cultures, that's when they start to get messy and sullied and fakes are brought in.
Sorry. Something that's just on the cusp of that, I think, and I don't know if you've looked at it at all, is the modern manufacture of jingle dresses. I don't know if you've looked at that at all.
No, I haven't.
If you look on YouTube, there are a lot of coverage of ritual dancing to heal. They're made with tobacco tin tops rolled.
Yep.
And the origin story is very interesting. When it happened, all of that. But now there are modern groups, especially with COVID, on the internet making them in groups with hundreds of jingles.
And are these Native women or not Native women?
Yeah, and it's mostly Midwest. Yeah, absolutely. But I think there are starting to be some non-Native women doing it. So it's not entered the commercial marketplace yet, but I think it may. So I think it's very interesting for you to look at that. You haven't seen it at all yet.
I haven't looked at that object type. I mean, I'm aware of them, and I've watched people dance in them.
Yeah.
No, thanks.
Sure.
With someone else.
Hi, Janet. It's me. So we talked about this earlier, but as a Pudapacha woman and understanding all of the complications with that settler colonial border to the south of us, I really feel sensitive to the presentation in terms of, I felt like there was a critique of the way that the Zapotec person was connecting himself, to the land or his ancestors and all of that, but also the critique of the Indonesian process. But then it was almost as if it was okay for white people to be replicating because they were following a particular process or because the person was married into a community. And I'm just wondering how that it sets up, I think, a complicated situation, particularly when there is so much racism from Native communities here in the United States against Native people south of that settler imposed border. And I'm just wondering, how is that complicated in the text? Because here, I don't think many people realize that there are, ancestral connections between tribes in Mexico and the Pueblo communities here. For example, even the Ho-Chunk people claim Mexican connections as well. And I'm just wondering, how is that addressed in the text itself?